last night we had a conversation at Aloud. How many people were at Aloud last night? No one came? Okay. Sarah Sunyan Bynum was there as well. And I'll just announce for those of you who are the MPW program, Sarah's going to teach a class for us in the fall, which we're really thrilled about. And tonight, we hope to lure Yiyun Li in sometime too, but she lives in Davis. She is the author of 2 collections of stories, most recently Gold Boy, Emerald Girl, which was just published. And from 2005, 1,000 Years of Good Prayers, and also a novel called The Vagrants. Yiyun is a native of Beijing, and she traveled to the University of Iowa as a science student in 1996, and she was studying immunology. But her scientific studies were interrupted when she started writing short stories, and she was a student at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and science is lost has been literature's gain. She's won many, many awards for her work, including the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award, the Hemingway Foundation Pen Award, the Whiting Writers Award, the Guardian First Book Award, and most recently she was named a MacArthur Genius in one of those 5-year grants. And she teaches writing at UC Davis. And one thing that recently she was named also one of the 20 under 40 writers by the New Yorker magazine. And this is when they, every now and then, they choose writers who have a special frisson. And Yiyun was chosen, and she's got immense critical acclaim, but she keeps her cool and continues writing her deeply idiosyncratic and compelling stories, which also have a kind of quiet mystery to them. Flannery O'Connor says that the ideal reader has, quote, the kind of mind that is willing to have its sense of mystery deepened by contact with mystery. And I think that's part of what Yiyun does, is she explores these mysteries, and I'm just so happy she's here tonight. So she will read, and then we'll have a Q&A and a reception. So please join me in welcoming Yiyun Li.
Oops.
Welcome.
Here.
This is for you too.
Oh, thank you. Okay. This is great. Thank you. Can you hear me? I need to raise my voice. This is such a beautiful room. It makes a difference to read in a beautiful room. I think I'm just going to read a little bit just to get this voice of this narrator. And I'm going to read from my new book. It's called Gold Boy, Emerald Girl. And I'm going to read from the opening story. Sort of just a couple excerpts. If you can hear her voice. Kindness. I am a 41-year-old woman living by myself in the same one-bedroom apartment where I have always lived, in a derelict building on the outskirts of Beijing. Apart from a trip to a cheap seaside resort taken with my parents the summer I turned 5, I have not traveled. I spent a year in an army camp in central China. Other than that, I have never lived away from home. In college, after a few failed attempts to convince me of the importance of being a community member, my advisor stopped acknowledging my presence, and the bed assigned to me was taken over by the 5 other girls in the dorm and their trunks. I have not married, and naturally have no children. I have few friends, though as I have never left the neighborhood. I have enough acquaintances, most of them a generation or 2 older. Being around them is comforting. Never is there a day when I feel that I am alone in aging. I teach mathematics in the middle school. I do not love my job or my students. But I have noticed that even the most meager attention I give to the students is returned by a few of them with respect and gratitude, and sometimes inexplicable infatuation. I pity those children more than I appreciate them. as I can see where they're heading in their lives. It is a terrible thing, you see, even for an indifferent person like me, to see the bleakness lurking in someone else's life. I have no hobby that takes me outside my flat during my spare time. I do not own a television set. But I have a room full of books at least half a century older than I am. I have never in my life hurt a soul, or if I have done any harm unintentionally, the pain I inflicted was the most trivial kind, forgotten the moment it was felt, if indeed it could be felt in any way. But that cannot be a happy life, or much of a life at all, you might say. That may very well be true. Why are you unhappy? To this day, if I close my eyes, I can feel Lieutenant Wei's finger under my chin, lifting my face to a spring night. Tell me, how can we make you happy? The question put to me 23 years ago have remained unanswerable, though it no longer matters. As you see, Lieutenant Wei died 3 weeks ago, at 46, mother of a teenage daughter, wife of a stationery merchant, veteran of Unit 20256, People's Liberation Army, from which she retired at 43, already afflicted with a malignant tumor. She was Major Wei in the funeral announcement. I do not know why the news of her death was mailed to me, except perhaps that the funeral committee thought I was one of her long-lost friends. I wonder if the announcement was sent to the other girls, though not many of them would still be at the same address. I remember the day when Lieutenant Wei's wedding invitation arrived in the distant past, and thinking then that would be the last time I would hear from her. I did not go to the funeral, as I had not gone to her wedding, both of which took place 2 hours by train from Beijing. It is a hassle to travel for a wedding, but more so for a funeral. One has to face strangers' tears, and worse, one has to repeat words of condolence to irrelevant people. When I was 5, a peddler came to our neighborhood one Sunday with a bamboo basket full of spring chicks. I was trailing behind my father for our weekly shopping of rationed food, and when the peddler put a chick in my palm, its small body soft and warm and shivering constantly, I cried before I could ask my father to buy it for me. We were not a rich family. My father worked as a janitor, and my mother, ill for as long as I could remember, did not work. And I learned early to count coins and small bills with my father before we set out to shop. It must have been a painful thing for those who knew our stories to watch my father's distress as 2 women offered to buy 2 chicks for me. My father, on the way home, warned me gently that the chicks were too young to last more than a day or 2. I built a nest for the chicks out of a shoebox and ripped newspapers, and fed them water-softened millet grains, and a day later, when they looked ill, aspirin dissolved in water. 2 days later, they died. The one I named Dot and marked with ink on his forehead, the first one to go, followed by Mushroom. I stole 2 eggs from the kitchen when my father went to help a neighbor fix a leaking sink. My mother was not often around in those days, and I cracked the eggs carefully and washed away the yolks and whites. But no matter how hard I tried, I could not fit the chicks back into the shells. And I can see to this day the half shell on Dot's head, covering the ink spot like a funny little hat. I have learned since then that life is like that, each day ending up like a chick, refusing to be returned to the eggshell. So that's the opening of this woman's monologue. And I'm going to read an early an early encounter of her with this professor. Professor Shen was in her early 60s, and I was 12 when she approached me on one September evening. I was on my way to the milk station. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. I looked down at the 2 empty bottles snuggled in the little carrier my father had woven for me. He had painted the dried reed different colors, and the basket had an intricate pattern, though by then the colors had all paled. My father had a pair of hands that were good at making things. The wooden pegs that he put on the foyer wall, the wooden pegs he put on the foyer wall for my school satchel and coat had red beaks and black eyes. The cardboard wardrobe had 2 windows that you could push open from inside. He had built my bed too, a small wooden one, painted orange, just big enough to fit in the foyer alongside the wardrobe. We lived in a 1-room unit, the room itself serving as a parent's bedroom, the foyer my bedroom. There was a small cube of kitchen and a smaller cube of a bathroom next to the foyer. Later it occurred to me that we could not afford much furniture. But when I was young, I thought it was a hobby of my father's, to make things with his own hands. Once upon a time, he must have made things for my mother too. But from the time my memory began, their bedroom had 2 single beds, my father's bare and neatly made, and my mother's piled with old novels. "Do you have a minute, I'm asking you?" the old woman said again. I had developed a look of distractedness by then, and she was now the most patient woman. So she followed Professor Shen up to her place. Professor Shen's place, a 1-room unit, seemed more crowded than ours, even though she lived there by herself. Apart from a table, a chair, and a single bed, the room was filled with trunks, dark leather ones with intricate patterns on the tops and sides, wooden ones with rusty metal clips, and 2 matching trunks, once bleached but by then more yellow than white, made of bamboo or perhaps straw, I couldn't tell which. On each trunk there were books. She moved a pile of books to make a spot for me to sit on her single bed, and then took a seat in the only chair in the room. Up to that point, I had not studied her, but I realized now that she was a beautiful woman even at her age. Her hair, grayish-white, was combed into a tight bun, not a single strand running loose. Her face, the high cheekbones, the very prominent forehead, and the deep-set eyes, reminded me of a photograph of a female Soviet pilot in my textbook. I wondered if she had mixed blood. It was a secret joy of mine to study people's faces. I must take that after my mother, who, apart from studying my face at meals, rarely took a bite. Sometimes, waiting for us to finish eating, she would comment on people passing by outside our window. Oily and puffy as fresh fried dough, she described the woman living a floor above us. The man next door had a long, bitter-looking face like a cucumber. My mother was the prettiest woman I had known until then, with almond-shaped eyes and a small, heart-shaped face, a straight and delicate nose, and as I later learned from her collection of romantic novels from the early 1900s, a cherry petal mouth. When she grew tired of watching the world, she would study her own face in an oval mirror. "A princess trapped in the fate of a handmaiden," she would say to no one in particular. My father, eating silently, would look up at her with an apologetic smile, as if he were a parent responsible for his child's deformed body. My father had married late in his life, my mother early. He at 50, and she at 20. 2 years later, they had me, their only child. When I was in elementary school, other children often mistook him for my grandfather. But perhaps that was because he had to be a parent to my mother too. Together, my mother and I made my father grow old fast. You could see that in his stooped back and sad smile. Do you always let your mind wander in front of your teacher? Professor Shan asked, though I could see the question was more an amusement than a criticism. In her youth, she must have been more beautiful than my mother. I wondered what my mother would think if she knew my opinion. One thing I was certain was that my mother would not get along well with Professor Shan, eccentricity being both women's prized possession. Thank you. Skip one page. Okay. Professor Shan studied me while I looked around the room, then picked up an old book and turned to a random page. Read a line to me, she said. The book was the first one in a series called Essential English, which Professor Shan had used to learn English 50 years ago. The page had a small cartoon of a child on a seat, the kind one would find in a luxury theater. In the cartoon, the child, who was not heavy enough to keep the seat from folding back, smiled uncertainly on his high perch, and I felt the same. I had entered middle school earlier that month and had barely learned my alphabet. When I could not read the caption, Professor Shan put the book back with the other volumes, their spines different colors that were equally faded. You do know that you are not your parents' birth daughter, don't you? She turned and faced me. And you do know that no matter how nicely they treat you, they cannot do much for your education, don't you? I had not doubted my blood until then. I knew that my parents were different from most parents. But I had thought that was their age difference and my mother's illness. Mo Yan. My mother sometimes said my name in a soft voice when my father was not around, and I would know that she had some secrets to tell me. A man can have children until he's 70, she would say. A woman's youth ends the moment she marries. Mo Yan, do not let a man touch you, especially here and here, she would say, gesturing vaguely towards her own body. Mo Yan, your father would get you a stepmother the moment I died, she would say, narrowing her eyes in an amused way. Do you know that I cannot die now because I don't want you to live under a stepmother? In one of these revelatory moments, she could have said, Mo Yan, you were not born to us. We only picked you up from a garbage dump. But no, my mother had never, even in her most uncharitable moments, said that to me. And in fact, she kept the secret until her death. And for that alone, I loved her and love her still. If your parents hadn't told you this, someone else must, Professor Shan said when I did not reply. One needs to know where she came from. Do you understand? I'm going to stop here. That's the opening of the novella. So shall we just...
Do you want to talk a little bit about the story?
The inspiration?
Yeah.
Yes, can I just grab quickly the Brighde Trevor book? Absolutely, yes. I actually brought this copy because I talked about it last night. So Kindness is a novella. It's actually a long story, so it's a novella length. And William Trevor is my favorite author, so I actually wrote that novella to talk to William Trevor's novella called Nights at Alexandra. And I'm going to read you the opening page so you can hear this narrator. You can clearly see my opening actually echoes his opening. I am a 58-year-old provincial. I have no children. I have never married. Harry, I have the happiest marriage in the world. Please, when you think of me, remember that. That is what I hear most often and with the greatest pleasure. Frau Messenger's voice as precisely recorded as memory allows, each quizzical intonation reflected in a glance or gesture. I must have replied something heaven knows what. It never mattered, because she rarely listened. The war had upset the messenger's lives, she being an Englishwoman and he a German. It brought them to Ireland and to Clover Hill, a sanctuary they most certainly would not otherwise have known. She explained to me that she would not have found life comfortable in Hitler's Germany, and her own country could hardly be a haven for her husband. They had thought of Switzerland, but Harry Messenger believed that Switzerland would be invaded, and the United States did not attempt them. No one but I, at that time an unprepossessing youth of 15, ever used their German titles. In the town where I had been born, they were Mr. and Mrs. Messenger. Yet it seemed to me, affectation I dare say, that in this way we should honor the strangers that they were. So that's the opening of Trevor's novella. And his story follows this 58-year-old provincial when he looked back at his early life. When he was a teenager, he had this sort of a youthful crush on this young woman, Mrs. Messenger. And the Messenger's marriage, also is an older man married a young woman, and they moved to Ireland. And so Harry loved both parties, that he loved the woman, of course, and the woman died. So he sort of kept loyal to the past. He was very loyal to the past and to the memory of this couple, so he never married. And the whole novella was he's telling the story of this couple and how he got to know them. So I thought, part of the reason I think I write is to talk to my master or to talk to the writers I love. So I did start writing kindness with the idea of writing a story to talk to his story. And so Mo Yan was this 41-year-old woman, single, never married, and in my imagination she was talking to Harry the whole time. And I always say that's in the real world it would never have happened because they live in different countries and different time. But I tried to imagine her talking to him, capturing that music, and so in the end I wrote this novella, and that's how the novella was written, purely to talk to another novella.
Last night, part of what the rubric was of this conversation with Sarah and Yiyun was the art of not knowing, and how you go into writing something and you know some things, but you don't know a lot of things, and how you discover them. So that was, something that we talked about. And is that, I don't know if we talked about this last night, but so you started with the character in the conversation, and then did the story of her life reveal itself? Right. I started with, it's very interesting because yesterday we talked about, the story really actually hits you when you were surprised as the author. And this story, I sort of know the arc. I knew the arc and the shape of the story, but one moment I didn't, because you quoted yesterday, stranger's kindness heals our wounds. And that was something that came as a surprise. And there was a long story. She was in the army, and her mother died. So she was going to catch the night train back to Beijing, and this driver was sending her off at the train station. The whole time I was writing, and then I don't know where this baby came from. At the train station, there was a very old man who could barely talk or stand, and he had a basket with him. And so when he was getting on the train, the narrator helped to pick up the basket, and she realized there was a baby in the basket, and the baby was sleeping with a curved finger under the face, making a dent on the cheek. That came from nowhere. And when I wrote that, I just thought, I really love that baby. I'm sorry, I just love that moment
and the curved finger. But that came from nowhere. But that's the moment I think, I mean, the narrator felt so much sadness, but also she was very fatalistic. She did not see a lot of hope in her life. But that moment I thought she saw the baby. A lot of things happened. But she would not tell us, but she cried later when she was on the train. She said, stranger's kindness, like time, it heals our wounds. So that, yes, not knowing, I think when I went in there, I never knew there was that moment when she would be sent out by a stranger and saw a baby. But that's really just the moment I loved.
Probably have questions brewing. I got to talk to Yiyun last night with Sarah, and so I don't want to monopolize the evening. So I know that you all have read 1,000 Years of Good Prayers, right? And, if you have questions, or feel free to open it up.
What fascinates you about Trevor's?
What fascinates me about Trevor? That's a very good question. What fascinates? It's very interesting. I think I always treat stories and novels and books like people, and it's very hard to explain why you like someone right away and can talk forever and ever. And sometimes you spend your whole life with somebody else and you never have anything to say to this person. That sounds very bleak. I'm sorry. In a way, I think I discovered Trevor when I just started to write fiction seriously. And I read really very widely when I first started, but none of the other writers really impressed me. I think just when I first started reading, the first book I read from him was The Hill Bachelors. And just something about the music or the mood of his stories really just drew me in. And ever since then, I've never stopped reading him. I've read his stories and novels again and again. And just to hear the music in his prose and to see how he sees people. He never mistreats one character in his book. In his stories, he always respects and loves his characters. And just that, that amount of understanding, I think it's rare to see someone who has that. So that's why I'm very drawn to his work. Do you like Trevor too?
I haven't read a lot of him. Mm-hmm. I do, and as you were reading his story, I could hear your voice and his voice. And I have writers that I like, but I'm curious what you, at your level now, what draws you to his work?
Oftentimes I think it's very interesting because sometimes my best friend Brighde always says you have to read someone else than Trevor, because Trevor is a very quiet writer and you're too quiet. But there are a lot of, we can discuss about that. But I think, in a way, writing is a very solitary activity. And in a way, I don't imagine my readers when I write, but I imagine which story from, say, Trevor, or sometimes others, John MacArthur, or some other writers. I would imagine my story talking to the story of one of these writers, and so that's really good because I think, especially Trevor's stories, they're all so different from my stories because the settings are so different, generations are different, and I just, in a way, I think I create story. Sometimes I even have a specific story from his collection. I would say I'm going to write a story to talk to this story. So one recent story, I think there's one story by Trevor called Three People. Have you read that story? It's in, I think it's in, I forgot which, in Hill Bachelors. So it's a story about three people. The title is Three People, and it's a story about this young woman who never married. As you would always see, people don't marry in Trevor's stories. And she lived with her father, who, was on the edge of dying. I mean, not really, but he was old, so one day he would die. And there was a young man, a little bit younger than the woman, who always came to visit her. And so the father would always wish they would get married one day. But only these two know they shared a very dark secret about one murder. I would not give away the story. So there was that danger in the story, but the father did not know, not knowing. The father just had this very tender thought about a young man, because he said he would die one day, and who would be with this woman? Who would be with the daughter? This young man was very loyal. So, but the story, because there was this murder these two shared, I would not give away. And in the end, the ending was so poignant, and it's about both characters thinking, when the father died, they would feel so dangerous around each other. And I mean, I cannot recite the last one, but it was just like, it hits you so hard. It hits you, and then you never recover from that hitting. So I wrote a story about three people. Sort of want to talk to that story. It's about an older woman and her son as a gay man. And the older woman was, knowing her son was gay, was trying to set up her son with her student, a female student, who had a long relationship with the mother. So again, all three of them were very lonely, but in the end, both characters, so that both two younger characters, like Trevor's two younger characters, they thought, there were lonely people in the world. If they treated each other with care and gentleness, they could have a marriage. So that's the story I just completely wrote to talk to three people. And it's fun. Then your story goes out to the world. Your story is not alone. Your story, I mean, only I know, but your story has a companion in the world somewhere in my imagination. Yeah. Yeah.
I know that when you talk about a story that is talking to another story, that it doesn't have to be a story in the first person, like Kindness. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering whether, when you write in the first person, do you feel more intensely that your speaker needs to know who he or she is telling the story to?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think first-person narrator is very hard to write. I mean, at least for me, I think, because I always ask myself, who is my narrator talking to? And most of the times, I don't know the answer. That's why I don't write first-person narrator often, because I really struggle with that. And so I think this story, Kindness, benefits from this narrator benefits from her knowing who she is talking to. But I think, when I teach writing, when I see my student stories, sometimes I do think, when they are not sure who their first person narrator is talking to, the story suffers a little. But just because when you talk to someone, you have to acknowledge there's a listener. And I think that adds an extra layer to the story. And I oftentimes ask my students who their first-person narrator, who they imagine their first-person narrator is talking to. And if they don't know, I think they have to figure out. But that listener doesn't have to be in the story. But I think the author has to know that. But do you feel that? It's very hard for me to write a first-person narrator.
Yeah, I do. We were actually, Jonathan and I were talking about Zoology Girl.
Oh, yes.
And about Never Let Me Go, but also we were talking about The Remains of the Day.
Yeah.
Also, and I was thinking, both of those novels, the reader doesn't know that there's a specific person. And I don't think the novel presumes that you think there is one. But there's a real sense of urgency, I think, in both of those narratives, that the person has to speak, and they have to speak now, and they know why they're telling the story now.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's so true.
And I felt that hearing the read from Kindness, the speaker has been heard to speak something.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting because that urgency you talk about, I think, There's this one Pritchard story, V.S. Pritchard story I really love. It's called You Make Your Own Life. Or You Make Your Own Life. I think that's the title. I forgot. But it's a first-person narrator, not about the first-person narrator's life or story. It's actually a very interesting story. So this first-person narrator said, I just happened to be in this town. I was stranded. The train was not coming. So I went upstairs to have a haircut. There was a man's salon, and when he went upstairs, he saw the barber was cutting someone's hair, and it took forever and ever and ever. And then the other customer left, and he sat down. He just made one comment about the other customer. This barber just opened up, and then it became a first-person narrator story. He told the whole story about they grew up as best friends. They both chased one woman, and the woman became his wife. Well, this friend, their childhood friend, was being cut, and it said, when they got married, he sent me the best present. He tried to kill himself, and he did not succeed in killing himself because he was using a razor, and he lost courage at the last time. And this barber blissfully commented, now he cannot shave himself. I go to his house every morning to shave him. It's a very evil story. It's a sinister story. But I like that, again, there are two first-person narrators. One is the first-person narrator, and then there's the barber telling the story. And I think that story is a very good example of, you realize that the real first-person narrator is also telling a story to somebody else. But then I think it's just very interesting, the setup. So I love teaching that story. When I taught that story in the undergraduate reading class, so funny. There were 70 students in my class, and I had them read them. I said, what do you think? And this boy raised his hand and said, well, Professor, we know you love dark stories, but this is just too dark. He said, this is too bleak. And it is actually a very sinister story, but it's fabulous. Yes.
In reading 1,000 Years of Midnight, I was kind of reminded a bit of how Joyce writes his character portraits in Dubliners. And I was just wondering, I know I've never actually written a whole character portrait, but when I'm walking down the street or something and I see someone, I almost want to make up their story, and I got a little bit of a sense of that in some of these, and I was wondering, is there a Granny Lynn out there that you just saw somewhere and you wrote a story about?
So funny. There was a Granny Lynn. There were more than one Granny Lynn out there. My mother, so funny, because when I published that story, my mother said, well, that's not your story, it's my story. My mother used to work for the first very, luxury, expensive private school in Beijing before she retired. So this was a long time ago, and I was in college. So one day she came home, and she said, guess what? My mother is a very good gossiper. She said, guess what? We caught this boy at school. He steals little girls' socks, and at night he rubs his cheek with the socks on his hand. And I thought, my goodness. But the thing is, everybody at school, everyone who taught at that school was just elated they caught this little boy. I know, it's so hard. It's a heartbreaking story, and I thought, when I started writing that story, I thought I wanted at least one person in the world who cared about this child. So Granny Lynn was there, but I sort of made her up. But that's interesting because I actually, a lot of stories, I started with minor characters from real life. And the main characters, I would sort of make their stories up. But if you like character sketches, there's this wonderful collection. I don't know if you probably have read Turgenev's the sketches of a huntsman's album. It's his first published collection, and it's really, when he wrote that collection, he did really mean that as a collection of sketches rather than short fiction. It was wonderful. There was one piece about, I mean, it's always about, there was a first-person narrator there who was this hunter who, roamed around his neighborhood, his regions, and hunted. And so sometimes he would, be stranded at a farmer's house or, be stranded somewhere. Then he started to eavesdrop on people around him and started to talk, started to describe these people around him. There was one piece in that about, I think one time in the summer night he was late, he couldn't return home, so he just camped outside in the field. And there were like a group of young boys between age 8 and 10, and these boys were not sleeping because they had horses at night. The horses were grazing, so the little boy's job was to watch the horses, not to let them run wild. And so you had a group of boys, and this narrator was lying down there, trying to sleep, but he couldn't sleep, so he started to hear the conversations of the little boys. And these young boys, he probably had, 8 boys, 10 boys in the group, and you get a sense some of them were older, and, that teenage bravado was coming in, and some of them were younger. And they started to tell ghost stories, and very typical of like little children. But at some point, the conversation, as the night progressed, the conversation became more and more serious. These boys actually were not talking about ghosts. They were talking about real people they knew who had died. And so they started to have a very heartbreaking conversation about death. It was so good. It was just wonderful. So I thought that's kind of, the character sketches. I really loved that one. The narrator knew certain things about these boys, but he also didn't know a lot. Again, it's not knowing. And he was writing about something he did not know, but he presented it in such a powerful way.
We have read some of your nonfiction as well. We read your wonderful piece about Tang from the New York Times, and from the New Yorker, the memoir about your grandfather. And I was wondering, listening to you talk about beginning a story and not knowing where it was going or really part of it would be. Since this is, as you know, it's a multi-genre program, and we have a lot of nonfiction writers in the room, actually, as well as fiction writers. Could you talk a little bit about the process when you write nonfiction?
Yes. It was so funny because I always write nonfiction very unwillingly. Part of the reason is I don't know why I like to make up stories, so there's always the worry that I'm making up stories when I write nonfiction, so I always have to be really adamant not making up things, which is not my natural instinct. My natural instinct is to tell lies, so to lie to people. So I think for me, or I should say, what you cannot achieve in fiction, maybe you can achieve in nonfiction. But actually, I don't believe that. I think everything you can achieve in nonfiction should be, you should be able to achieve in fiction. But I think I write nonfiction mostly because they pay me to write. Most nonfiction pieces are commissioned, but also there are little things you cannot quite fit into fiction sometimes. You don't know where to fit these things. And like for my grandfather's piece, that actually started with an idea because the New Yorker was doing a food issue. So my agent called me and said that they're writing about food. Do you want to write a piece about food? And I was probably just a little bit defiant. I thought, you spend so much time talking about food. So I said, I want to pitch a piece about hunger for the food issue. And my agent said, well, this is a great idea. Either they will hate it or they will love it. And so I just thought, I think with nonfiction it's very important, like what idea you pitched to them. before you start. So once they approve of that, the hunger, the theme of hunger, and then I think writing it became a little bit easier for me. So I don't know. I feel that, again, I think maybe that's different. Maybe, Bridget, you can tell me if my thinking is right or wrong. I think with fiction, you really do start with curiosity about your characters and about things you don't know, and you start to write a story to find out. I think with nonfiction, I probably do start with something I already know, like the effect I want to achieve, or the things I want to tell. So in the end, I think those nonfiction pieces are more about how to tell the stories most effectively, in a way.
Well, but there's a realization. I mean, you give yourself a realization that it's about your grandfather, about the soup.
Oh.
Did you know that was where you were going when you began?
Yes, that's sort of why. But sometimes also, like I did a piece for Granta recently. They asked me to write a piece about my first job, which actually is a very boring assignment, I would say. And I turned into something else, and I was quite happy about that. I actually, that's one thing that you want to have something out of. You want to get something out of writing that piece. And for me, it's just how to write an assignment, not to follow their directions. So I wrote that piece, which was about my first job, but it was actually completed about something else. So in the end, I was more than happy. I just thought I got something out of it rather than just writing a very boring piece. I think that's why I'm always very hesitant writing nonfiction, because either I have to really think hard to make a boring assignment into an interesting assignment, or I have to suffer. And I don't want to suffer when I write, so then that means I tried very hard to entertain myself. Yes.
You talked earlier about Travers and his treatment of characters, and I was curious what you really liked about how he treated them, and how you feel treatment of characters is different in fiction and nonfiction.
The treatment of characters. I think, there are, like, if you look at people in the world, sometimes I feel like a lot of people need attention, but on a very surface level, and they don't, what people really want is understanding, being understood, and I think that's what characters want. All the characters want to be understood by the readers, or want to be understood by the creator. But I think in some minor work, or some work that not very good, in the end, I think what happened is the characters were all fighting for attention. So they could either be very loud. What are you laughing?
It's just such a wonderful description.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bridget.
No, it's
Okay.
I was laughing in appreciation.
Oh, thank you. I feel that, there are a lot of loud characters, or, they carry out dramatic moments, but I don't think that helps the reader to understand them, or help the readers to connect to these characters. So I feel that, if you acknowledge that your characters, even though sometimes they don't say things to each other, oftentimes they don't. They lie to each other, or they make up stories but in the end, I think they want that understanding from the readers. And that's always where I start, writing. I want to understand the character, even though this character, might be very solitary, or might be crazy, or might be very selfish, but still anyone deserves understanding. So I think that's what I think Trevor is really strong at, because he really thinks and thinks and thinks, and he understands every character. And, a lot of times, like, his prose can be really quiet, but after you read his stories, you realize he knows that character so well. He knows everything. You don't need to know anything more, because he already he sort of presents. So So I guess what you asked treatment. So I think in fiction, I really do. I don't want to laugh. I don't ever want to laugh at my characters, and even if they are very stupid, I think they still deserve understanding. Or I don't laugh at my characters, but I also don't, treat them very kindly. I think you have to be both very gentle and very cruel to your character, because sometimes characters are like people. If you want something, you have to push. You always have to have your stories to push the characters. So you cannot be too gentle about the character. You cannot let the characters get away with anything they want. So in that sense, I think you get to know the character. But nonfiction, I think, really this. I think. In nonfiction, you cannot, I could not change my grandfather's story. I could only change the way I tell it, so to sort of present him in the way that would suit him the best. So in that way, I do laugh at my grandfather all the time because he's a very lovely person. So I don't know if I answered your question. Yes, I also think you have to, for me, I think one reason I'm so unwilling to write nonfiction is because you have to look at your own life or your parents' marriage or, these things that in fiction I can explore without any inhibition. And in nonfiction, I still have to think this is, my parents still live in this life and still live in this marriage. I mean, not to protect them, but sort of just, I think I need to be braver to explore those things. And so I'm sort of in between. I haven't really written about them or about the things that I think are still going on. Because when I did a piece for the New Yorker, and it's about my parents' marriage, and the editor called and said, the New Yorker has this rule that if you write about someone in nonfiction, they have to approve. You have to get approval from your characters or your subjects. And I said, no, my parents don't read English. No, don't send to them. I said, also don't fact check with them. Please fact check with my sister. My sister lives in the States, so they actually fact checked with my sister, and she's okay with that. Except it's not about her. So I think it's hard just to think, I think it's more complicated to think about the characters in nonfiction.
And after writing nonfiction, has it changed the way you've written your fiction?
That's a very good question. A little bit. I think I used to write fiction only just to tell a story or to explore this character that I wanted to know. But when I write nonfiction, oftentimes I start with a question that I want to, find the answer. And now more and more, I think even my fiction, I start with questions that I want to explore. But storytelling-wise, it's the same, I think. In nonfiction, you're still telling stories. I mean, I am. I would love to be able to write essays. I love Montaigne. I read Montaigne all the time. He's so silly. He's so full of himself. He's so serious. He keeps talking about his kidney. I just love him when he keeps talking about his kidney stone. I think that's his favorite topic, his kidney stone. So but even in Montaigne, I remember when I was in grad school, I was in the nonfiction program too, and we had this one semester of lecture reading Montaigne. And a lot of people actually dislike that because, and I actually loved it so much because I realized, whatever topic you talk about, Montaigne has already talked about. Mm-hmm. So I always say, as a fiction writer, you can never run out of topics. If you don't know what to write, just open to, a page of Montaigne and see what he writes about. He said on courage, on friendship, on three women. I think those are just endless topics. So I love him very much. Yes.
I have a question in regard to nonfiction. I read a lot of nonfiction, and I sort of like if you're depending on your memory to remember like someone's character to like really, you know, like build up the character and get your audience close with, you know, that individual, like how often do you, I guess, like embellish or like,
Yes.
you know, I don't know.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting. I can tell you a story. It's not my story. It's a friend of mine's story when I went to grad school with her. And she's the kind of a writer who would not make up anything. She keeps a journal very meticulously in throughout her life. She just, because she's so afraid of, she was writing about a memoir about a legal, you know, case. And in her instance, she could not make up anything. I mean, she has to be right? So, but it's also about something, you know, 10 years ago, so she had to rely on her memory. So very interesting. She told me, she said she took this course, which is, you know, they had a very interesting assignment. So the professor asked them to write a nonfiction piece, and she wrote this one chapter of her memoir. She turned in, and it was fine. And the assignment was to change one thing in that piece into fiction and see how the whole piece was changed. And she said, well, you know, people would change names or characters or stories. She said, I could not make up anything. And she also had this, you know, inhibition of making up anything. So she just, in the storytelling, she gave a can of Coke to the character, which never happened in reality. She said, you know what, I changed the chapter completely because the character had a can of Coke. And that can of Coke became the whole metaphor about these canned feelings and everything. So she said the chapter turned out to be different from the original draft. I thought that was very telling. You know, is she lying to put a can of Coke in her hands, or is she embellishing? I don't know. So I thought that's very interesting. But for me, I think that's because, you know, because of those things, when I write about memories, I sort of want to, I mean, my tendency is to acknowledge that's memory. So it's not, you know, you have to sort of acknowledge that there's mix-up in memories. And there's, you know, misinterpretation. But I think also just writing, like, I don't know, maybe it's just for me, writing about memories is like, I mean, memories are kind of like your conscience is kind of like a dream. So if you write in a way that can make a dream seem true, I think, you know, to affect your readers, I don't know, I think that's good enough. I'm making up things now, I'm sorry. I have this bad problem of making up.
There's a screenwriting class that a few of us are taking for our main character. We've been assigned to go back 2 generations prior and, you know, start the character profile and with the grandparents. And like my main character is 29 years old and he starts a story. But doing that exercise, I mean, I had 12 pages. He was 12 years old. I had 12 pages. That was, in that process is how I was really learning to know him, you know. So I'm curious, I mean, that's been an educational process for me. I'm curious, how do you said you really want to know your characters. Because that's their one of their needs, is to be known. How do you get to know your characters in fiction?
That's a very good question. I can give you an unsuccessful example of how I don't know. I mean, this is work in progress. I wrote a story a couple months ago. I wrote a story in December, January, about this middle-aged woman. She was divorced, and I thought the story was great. I showed to my reader, and I mean, I actually knew there were certain things I did not answer in the story, but I thought I wrote it in the way that I answered them. So she was married to a man, and they divorced, but they kept a friendly relationship. So I showed to my friend, my reader, and she asked a lot of questions. One question she asked was, how did they decide to get married? Did he propose? What kind of proposal did he do? And did she want to marry him? Because they were from two generations, older man and young woman. And when they got divorced, who asked for the divorce? Who the other party react? I mean, all these seems very simple questions. Actually, a lot of them I actually don't know. So I'm writing to find out the answer. But I think that's exactly what you're talking. You need to know your characters. That's so funny because it's such a basic thing. Because I always ask my students, I notice that my students have work, oftentimes their characters don't work. I mean, they either sit on the ceiling, on the roof all day long, or they just wander in the street. So I always ask them, how they make a living, what they eat at breakfast, do they read newspaper? But these are little things, but no, they're not little. They're how you know your characters. So I also was very surprised. Despite all these years, I've been telling my students to know the characters. I don't know my characters either. It's very discouraging. Yes.
You're saying that the characters want to be understood. One thing I really like about the stories of yours is that a lot of the characters had a lot of bad things happen to them. I didn't really pity any of them. And I'm wondering, do you think is the best way to accomplish that in the writing, to have the characters have these bad things happen to them, but yet don't pity them?
Can you give one example, one character, something bad?
Well, even Granny Lynn,
Okay.
she had a lot.
Funny thing is, I don't think my characters ever think their life is bad. It's so funny because the other day I was in the waiting room and this woman was on the phone. I'm a big eavesdropper. my biggest hobby is to eavesdrop on people. And this woman was calling her cousin, who did not recognize her. I mean, I can tell you the complete story about this woman without knowing what the other party was talking about. So she hadn't called her cousin for a long, long, long time. Her cousin was Reverend John, who was retired. And in their generation, there were 14 kids, and this woman was the youngest grandchild. And I mean, she just went on and on. I mean, and I gathered all this information from her. I did not hear the other side. At one point, I think the cousin told her one of the other cousins died recently. And she stopped for a moment. She said, "Oh, well," she said, "I did not know. Had I known, I would have sent some flowers. But you know what, cousin? We come here not to stay. We come here to leave this world. And I'll tell you, I'm the happiest woman in the world." I always remember this. "I'm the happiest woman in the world. If I crash tomorrow, I tell you, I have no regrets. I have lived every day of my life with joy and happiness." And I thought, you are lying. You are lying. You are lying. But that's how characters do. They lie to themselves. I don't think my characters ever think their life is harsh. Sometimes their life is really harsh. But part of the reason is they lie to themselves. Part of it is, it's normal life to them. I think my characters always want to live very seriously. They want to love seriously. They want to they want to eat. They don't want to be hungry. They have all these things they want. And they really just live their lives very seriously. And I think bad things could happen to your character, but if they don't, it's not something they just keep saying, "Oh, my mother killed me." My mother killed me. That's the wrong thing like that. I mean, if they don't just use that, I think the readers would not pity them.